So chapter 9 is on the church in the modern world. You'll notice it's going to have a lot of overlap with 7 because they talk about evangelization a lot. It overlaps with 10 because 10 will talk about vocations and the hierarchy. And since this chapter talks a lot about the Pope, it sort of overlaps with 10 in that regard. But it's basically asking the question how the church encounters the modern world. So in thinking about that, the first question they ask us is, how should we witness our faith in the world today? And especially for Americans, the big question for us is, in a society that really values individualism, in a culture that treats religion as something private, and in a culture that values religious freedom, how do we witness our faith in a way that also respects the dynamic of religious freedom? So we're going to look at that question, and I have a little handout for you. But I have a video for you from Father Barron talking about the importance of religious freedom. And so religious freedom is a basic human right and a foundational principle of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church, that everybody has the right to religious freedom. So we uphold and protect not just our religious freedom, but everybody's. That being said, we're still called to live our faith publicly. So we're called to evangelize and to share our faith. And the question is, how do we do that while respecting other people's religious freedom? So the idea is that faith should be both an invitation and a free response. So we should give witness to our faith in public, not just in church. Our voice needs to be part of the voice in the marketplace. But the question is, how do we do that in a way that's respectful of other people? So I'm going to show you this video from Father Barron, and I'm going to pass out a handout we're going to look at in a second. But here are some of Father Barron's reflections on the issue of religious freedom.
Well, I'm just back from a wonderful 2-week trip to England with my Word on Fire team. We traveled from Durham in the north to London in the south by way of Leeds and Liverpool and Birmingham and Oxford, as well as some side trips to Lindisfarne, the great the kind of ruins of a Benedictine monastery from long ago, and then to Ampleforth, which is the biggest active Benedictine house in England, and finally to Castle Howard, which is the place where they filmed a lot of Brideshead Revisited, one of my favorite programs. So it was just a great tour of England, and I was giving lectures and talks and so on. And I was struck over and over again, I must say, by the vitality of the church in England. Certainly it's a society which has become largely secularized, they say, but the church, I must say, is vibrant in many ways. And I was very moved, for example, by my talks to seminarians in Birmingham and London. Gave some academic lectures in Durham and London. So it was just a great, uplifting trip. But the other enduring impression I have from that trip is how the 16th century is still very much a living reality. Now, when I say 16th century, of course, I mean that really terrible period when we had the wars of religion, basically in England, when the Anglican Church had split off from the Catholic Church, and then under Elizabeth I, Catholics were pretty brutally persecuted. What struck me was how that's not just a distant event in the past. That's still very much of a lively reality. Give you some examples. We went to Ushaw College, which is a beautiful place. It was a seminary, Catholic seminary near Durham for many, many years. Just closed because the numbers got too small. But they showed us the treasures of Ushaw. And they included these little tiny liturgical vessels, chalices and cruets and so on. Why tiny? Well, they were used during that recusant period when they had to say Mass very clandestinely and had to hide vessels. They also showed, I was very moved by this, an altar stone, so a little stone that had the relics of a saint in it, and they would say Mass on that altar stone. But it was the size of a shingle, and it was carved as a shingle, so that after Mass, they just put it up on the roof to hide it, We went to Durham Cathedral, a magnificent building, and we saw there the ruins, a few little remnants of these lively, colorful frescoes, which had been stripped away, of course, during the iconoclastic Protestant period. I went back to Leeds, where I was a few years ago, and we visited the cathedral there. And I did a video a few years ago about this, the skulls of these two martyrs that are in the altar at Leeds. It's a very moving story about a young priest and his older protector, who were both arrested and they were killed, and their skulls have found their way to that altar. I was at Oscott College in Birmingham. When I was there, they showed me the pulpit from which John Henry Newman gave the great Second Spring address. That was a talk upon the restoration of the Catholic hierarchy in England, so that they established dioceses and bishops again, after 300 years of repression. I went to Allen Hall, which is the Catholic seminary in London. Where is it built? Well, it's built right on the site of Thomas More's great house by the river in Chelsea. And there's actually a mulberry tree from the 16th century that Thomas More would have known, still on the grounds. And of course, Thomas More, who famously opposed the Act of Supremacy and paid for his opposition with his life, having been beheaded in 1535. I ended up the trip in St. Patrick's in Soho, which is a very lively Catholic parish. And we rolled out the series. I talked about the Catholicism series, and I gave a little talk. And at the end of that, the pastor handed me a reliquary with the relics of one of the London martyrs from that period and asked me to bless the crowd with it. So over and over again, you see the 16th century alive, this time of terrible repression. Some of it was summed up for me on a very brief visit. One of the few downtimes I had, I went to Westminster Abbey. And many years ago, I'd visited the tomb of Elizabeth I. But this time I had a little audio guide, so I was getting more information. And I didn't realize that in the very same grave as Elizabeth I is her half-sister, Mary Tudor. And of course, Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII. She was queen for a short period and, of course, instituted Catholicism in England. And then she died and was succeeded by Elizabeth, who then turned on the Catholic Church. So it's very moving to think of those two women in the same grave. And so much of history, has turned around that conflict. Now, I bring all this up not to demonize Anglicanism. As I mentioned, during Mary's reign, brief as it was, there was a terrible kind of bloody war against Protestants. And so there's plenty of blame to go around in terms of this terrible persecution. The reason I bring it up is to show the absolute centrality of this issue of religious liberty. I know a lot of us have been talking about it recently, but that's what was going on in the 16th century, was a massive and very violent repression of religious liberty. See, why is that so important? I think it's why it haunts the English imagination to this day, because, as John Paul II said, religious liberty is the most fundamental of the rights that we have. Think of the right to, assembly, the right to speech, et cetera, et cetera. The right to worship as one sees fit and to live one's religious life as one sees fit is the most fundamental of the rights. Why? Because it has to do with the most important relationship we can possibly have, that with God, and it reaches down to the deepest level of one's personhood. We speak of the person as inviolable, Well, what's the deepest level of the person? It's that person in relation to God. And that's why religious liberty is absolutely fundamental, why it's basic. Something I find fascinating, look at up and down the centuries. Tyrants, both ancient and modern. Elizabeth was a tyrant, but tyrants both ancient and modern first go after religious liberty. See, because a tyrant wants to reach into that place. That's what a tyrant wants. They want not just to dominate people's bodies, if you want, they want to dominate the mind and the soul. They want to get into that most sacred place where God alone should reign, And that's why we'll find it. Look at the Soviet Union. Look at Communist China. Look at any tyranny. They go after religion first, That's what we saw, I think, in England in the 16th century, and why it still haunts the English church to this day. Now, as I mentioned before in these videos, and I don't want to over-dramatize it. What we're going through now is nothing like the 16th century, nothing anywhere near as brutal as that. Nevertheless, there is an attack within the secularist society against religious liberty. What's interesting to me in England is the old foes, by which I mean Catholics and Protestants, are now coming together because they both feel the attack coming from a secularist ideology that wants to kick religion off the public stage. And of course, as I've commented before, we do find in our country now as a more secularist kind of ideology does, it seem, want to exclude Catholicism from the public arena. Here's my overall point, and I've talked about this before, but see, this ought to concern everybody in a free society, not just Catholics, not just religious people. It ought to concern everyone because an attack on religious liberty is an attack on the most fundamental human right, and that's dangerous for anyone in a free society.
Reflecting on what Father Barron said, it goes to sort of what our book says here. We're called to live our faith publicly and to give witness to our faith not only in our churches but also in the marketplace. So he pointed out that in secular society, the right of the church to express its views on what's going on in the world and the right of Catholics to express our views and practice our faith is coming under attack. One of the ways it's come under attack, for example, is the Obama administration's health care laws. They are trying to, force the church to violate its teachings, and there are lawsuits right now that are going through the courts trying to protect our right to religious freedom and to practice religious freedom as we see it. And that's when he's talking about the attack on religious freedom, that's part of what he's referencing. Also, there's just the idea that everybody gets free speech except for the church. Everyone's allowed to express their opinions except for religious people. And that's not fair. We have every right to share and witness our faith so long as we're doing it as an invitation. As it says here, to force religious faith on anyone empties it of love, life, and promise. So the key thing in sharing our faith is that we do so in a loving way and in an inviting way and not in an obtrusive or a pushy way. Yeah, question?
What part of healthcare
The main issue with the Obama's health care law, the so-called Obamacare, it forces Catholic institutions to pay for contraceptives, which violates our church teachings. And there is I'd have to look up the specific lawsuit, but the one I've heard talked about the most is one coming from a group of nuns who run a hospital, a small, I think it's an elder care facility, and when they started initiating the new health care laws, one of the things that it forces employers to do is to pay for contraceptives. But as you know, the Catholic Church opposes the use of contraceptives, and they don't pay for it for their employees because it violates our church teaching. So the new health care law is forcing Catholic institutions to do that, and the question is, from the church's perspective, that violates our religious freedom. So the question would also come up, I don't know if this has come up yet, or if it's just part of the contraceptive issue, is would the Catholic institutions also be forced to pay for abortions, which we also oppose. So, I don't know if the courts have started hearing these things yet, but it's one of the things that come up and in terms of Obamacare. But thinking about this question, it's an important question for us to look at because it causes attention, I think, especially for Americans, because we want to respect everyone else's religious freedom, and we want to respect, but we also want to be able to share our faith. So the question is, how do we do this? How do we do this in a way that is a conversation That's, I think, the most important thing. We need to be able to have a conversation. And a conversation means that everybody gets to express their opinion. If you've ever talked with someone and they don't let you say your side of the story, you know how that is. Everybody needs to be able to say their side of the story. And in a conversation, there's two-way communication, and also both sides are respected. You can't have a conversation with someone who's screaming at you, telling you you're wrong. So when we're thinking about how we express our religious freedom in a public setting, it has to be a conversation, it has to be a two-way dialogue, and it has to be fair, not a yelling match. Again, it has to be invitation, and we're not trying to force our views on anyone, but we need to be able to be part of the conversation. If America is going to be about justice and freedom, we need to be able to have our voice heard as well. And of course, we have to do it in a loving way, because if we don't, that's what Pope Francis has been trying to emphasize. If we don't, no one's going to want to hear what we have to say. So thinking about exercising religious freedom, I have this handout for you, and it asks you to reflect. It says, try to identify a particular experience when you felt uneasy in a situation due to your Christian beliefs, or you responded to a problem out of what you see as your Christian duty, or you felt ignored or ridiculed on account of your faith, or you were comforted by your faith to overcome a difficult period in your life. So they give you so many options there. You're just going to reflect about one. You must have experienced at least one of those at some point in your life. And then, so it says, think about your thoughts and feelings at such a time. Try to recall how other people of similar or different faith backgrounds treated you. So, what happened sort of down here, describe what happened a little bit. One thing that was really interesting was in some of the other classes, some of the students wrote about a situation, and then they wrote how they would have acted differently now that they look back upon it. That was really interesting to see those reflections. So reflect on that on your paper, and then share with your family members in a small group. You can kind of maybe make some notes in comparison. Do you notice any similarities or difference in one another's experiences? What can you learn from this? So take a few minutes to think about when you experienced one of those situations listed on the handout, and then get with your family and discuss it. And while you guys are starting to reflect, I just wanted to point out to you a extra credit assignment that I have on Moodle. So let me just pause my recording here. The idea of the church in the modern world and how we share our faith. Did we watch this yet with Pope Francis in the... No? All right. So each year, one of the ways we witness our faith is through the idea of the Pope as a world leader. So every year at Christmas, the Pope delivers a message at the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and the message begins with the words, Urbi et Orbi, which means to the city and to the world. And in these addresses, the Pope will sort of apply the gospel to world issues like world hunger, nuclear disarmament, the plight of immigrants, the human rights of all people, violence and injustice. So the Pope doesn't just talk about matters of faith. Think about when we watched the Sister Rose documentary. One of the things that since Vatican II, the Church has looked back upon is the way the Church dealt with World War II. The Church didn't really do anything officially. Now, there were individual Catholics who died saving Jews. There were individual priests who stood up for the rights of Jews and who would wear Stars of David. But as the official entity, the Vatican itself and the Pope as the leader of the Church, they kind of tried to stay neutral, thinking that was the best course of action. And and when we look back on that, it's kind of, I think there's some regret there that we should have done more. And I think since then, the popes have always tried to sort of give the world some perspective on what's going on. For example, every pope, ever since World War II, when the United States gets in a conflict, they'll usually come out and make a statement. It's usually always against whatever war we're in, but they'll come out and say, this isn't, let's think about this. Let's not go to war. Let's try to have peace. So they comment on things that traditionally the church hasn't commented on because somebody has to be the voice of Christ in the world. So this is an example of, it's just a summary of some of the things Pope Francis talked about.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, buona e santa Pasqua. Risuona nella Chiesa sparsa in tutto il mondo l'annuncio dell'angelo alle donne. Voi non abbiate paura. So che cercate Gesù il crocifisso. Non è qui, è risorto. Venite, guardate il luogo dove era stato deposto. Voi non abbiate paura, il Signore è risorto. Questo è il culmine del Vangelo, è la buona notizia per eccellenza. Gesù, il crocifisso, è risorto. Questo avvenimento è alla base della nostra fede e della nostra speranza. Se Cristo non fosse risorto, il cristianesimo perderebbe il suo valore. Tutta la sua missione della Chiesa esaurirebbe la sua spinta, perché è da lì che è partita e che sempre riparte. Il messaggio che i cristiani portano al mondo è questo. Gesù, l'amore incarnato, è morto sulla croce per i nostri peccati, ma Dio Padre lo ha risuscitato e lo ha fatto Signore della vita e della morte. In Gesù l'amore ha vinto sull'odio, la misericordia sul peccato, il bene sul male, la verità sulla menzogna, la vita sulla morte. Per questo noi diciamo a tutti, venite e vedete. In ogni situazione umana segnata dalla fragilità, dal peccato e dalla morte, la buona notizia non è soltanto una parola, ma è una testimonianza d'amore gratuito e fedele. È uscire da sé per andare incontro all'altro, è stare vicino a chi è ferito dalla vita, è condividere con chi manca del necessario, è rimanere accanto a chi è malato o vecchio o escluso. Venite e vedete. L'amore è più forte, l'amore dona vita, l'amore fa fiorire la speranza del deserto. Con questa gioiosa certezza nel cuore, noi oggi ci rivolgiamo a te, Signore risorto. Aiutaci a cercarti affinché tutti possiamo incontrarti, sapere che abbiamo un Padre e non ci sentiamo orfani, che possiamo amarti e adorarti. Aiutaci a sconfiggere la piaga della fame, aggravata dai conflitti e dagli immensi sprechi di cui spesso siamo complici. Rendici capaci di proteggere gli indefessi, soprattutto i bambini, le donne e gli anziani, a volte fatti oggetto di sfruttamento e di abbandono. Fa che possiamo curare i fratelli colpiti dall'epidemia di Ebola in Guinea Conakry, Sierra Leone e Liberia, e quelli affetti da tante altre malattie che si diffondono anche per l'incuria e la povertà estrema. Consola quanti oggi non possono celebrare la Pasqua con i propri cari, perché strappati ingiustamente ai loro affetti, come le numerose persone, sacerdoti e laici, che in diverse parti del mondo sono state sequestrate. Conforta coloro che hanno lasciato le proprie terre per migrare in luoghi dove poter sperare in un futuro migliore, vivere la propria vita con dignità e non di rado professare liberamente la propria fede. Ti preghiamo, Gesù glorioso, fa cessare ogni guerra, ogni ostilità, grande o piccola, antica o recente. Ti supplichiamo in particolare per la Siria, la amata Siria, perché quanti soffrono le conseguenze del conflitto possano ricevere i necessari aiuti umanitari e le parti in causa non usino più la forza per seminare morte, soprattutto contro la popolazione inerme, ma abbiano l'audacia di negoziare la pace, ormai da troppo tempo attesa. Gesù glorioso, ti domandiamo di confortare le vittime delle violenze fratricide in Iraq e di sostenere le speranze suscitate dalla ripresa dei negoziati tra israeliani e palestinesi. Ti imploriamo che venga posta fine agli scontri nella Repubblica Centroafricana e che si fermino gli efferati attentati terroristici in alcune zone della Nigeria e le violenze in Sud Sudan. Ti chiediamo che gli animi si volgano alla riconciliazione e alla concordia fraterna in Venezuela. Per la tua risurrezione, che quest'anno celebriamo insieme con le chiese che seguono il calendario giuliano, ti preghiamo di illuminare e ispirare iniziative di pacificazione in Ucraina, perché tutte le parti interessate, sostenute dalla comunità internazionale, intraprendano ogni sforzo per impedire la violenza e costruire in uno spirito di unità e di dialogo il futuro del Paese. che loro come fratelli possano oggi gridare Christos Voskres. Per tutti i popoli della terra ti preghiamo, Signore. Tu che hai vinto la morte, donaci la tua vita, donaci la tua pace. Christus surrexit. Venite e videte. Cari fratelli e sorelle, buona Pasqua.
Il Santo Padre Francesco, a tutti i fedeli presenti e a quelli che ricevono la sua benedizione, a mezzo della radio, della televisione e delle nuove tecnologie di comunicazione, concede l'indulgenza plenaria nella forma stabilita dalla Chiesa. Preghiamo Dio Onnipotente perché conservi a lungo il Papa a guida della Chiesa e conceda pace e unità alla Chiesa in tutto il mondo.
Santi Apostoli Petrus et Paulus, de quorum potestate et autoritate confidimus, ipse intercedam pro nobis ad Dominum.
Amen.
Precibus et meritis beati Mariae semper Virginis, beati Michaelis Arcangeli, beati Ioannis Baptiste, et Sanctorum Apostolorum Petri et Pauli, et Onium Sanctorum. Misereatur vestri omnipotens Deus, et dimissis omnibus peccatis vestris, perducat vos, Iesus Christus ad vitam aeternam.
Amen.
Indulgentiam, absolutionem et remissionem omnium peccatorum vestrorum, spatium vere et fructuose penitentiae, cor semper penitens et emendationem vitae, gratiam et consolationem Sancti Spiritus, et finalem perseverantiam in bonis operibus, tribuat vobis omnipotens et misericors Dominus.
Amen.
Amen. Et benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, descendat super vos et maniat semper.
Amen.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, rinnovo il mio augurio di buona Pasqua a tutti voi giunti in questa piazza da ogni parte del mondo. Estendo gli auguri pasquali a quanti da vari paesi sono collegati attraverso i mezzi di comunicazione sociale. Portate nelle vostre famiglie e nelle vostre comunità il lieto annuncio che Cristo, nostra pace e nostra speranza, è risorto. Grazie per la vostra presenza, grazie per la vostra preghiera e per la vostra testimonianza di fede. Un pensiero particolare e riconoscente per il dono dei bellissimi fiori che provengono dai Paesi Bassi. Buona Pasqua a tutti, buon pranzo e arrivederci.
example of how the Pope speaks, not just on behalf of the church, but to world issues. Because somebody's got to speak for Jesus. Because if we don't, who else is gonna? The Christians of the world have to sort of bring to bear the gospel on what goes on in the world. So you guys are, just a few minutes, are going to make blogsters on how the Pope plays a role as a world leader. But some other examples here is that he's the leader of the universal church on earth, but he's also the head of state. He's the head of state of the Vatican, which is sort of its own little entity there in Rome. He has also the vocation and mission to bring the gospels and its values to the world. And so he does that through the Urbi et Orbi addresses. He just, the other day, was talking about how we have to do more for the poor. So the Pope is, part of his role is to sort of help us see the world through the lens of the gospel. He invites the world into conversation with the Christian faith, and he meets regularly with presidents, prime ministers, and other heads of state and diplomats. He just met with President Obama a few months ago. Now, obviously, if the Pope said to President Obama, I want you to do X, Y, Z, I want you to end abortion in America, the president doesn't have to listen to him. But at least it gives people a different perspective. And he also doesn't just meet with heads of state, but he also meets with the leaders of other world religions. I was just on the Twitter the other day and was reading an article about a future meeting between Pope Francis and the leaders of the Orthodox churches. And some people are getting really excited that we may find a way to come even closer again since the schism in 1054. People are really excited about this meeting because they think it's not just going to be for show. It might actually have something come out of it. So he shares the church's vision of the world and applies its teaching of the gospel to world affairs. So obviously when things happen, the Pope will speak so that, and this is sort of part of that idea of the teaching voice of the church, the magisterium. So, when things change so fast. And one of the things about Catholics is when we ask, well, how are we supposed to understand these things, we have the Pope to look to. I like that. I like knowing I don't have to wonder how I should interpret changing events in light of the gospel. I can look to the Pope and to the bishops in the church, and they can give me a way to sort of understand it. This isn't to say that you aren't going to interpret things on your own, but at least we have something to check our own interpretations against. So, and then he offers opportunities for other world leaders to reflect on their decisions and policies in the light of the wisdom of Christ. So he sort of stands as almost like a mirror. And the world can look into that mirror and kind of match up. Am I reflecting gospel values? Am I reflecting the values of Christ, the values of God? Or am I not? And again, we have to diverse world with many cultures and religions, at the end of the day, what's good and true comes from God. So any person of any faith, if we're teaching good and truth, they should be able to embrace that. So it's not a matter of pushing our values on other people. These are the universal values of God. And things that are good, everyone will embrace. So finally, the Church in the ongoing history of humanity. The Pope has a unique opportunity to challenge social policies that are making a world a dark place in which to live. One of the famous times the Pope did that was when St. John Paul II wrote his famous line about our culture being a culture of death. And when he said that, it captured everybody's attention, and people asked, well, what does he mean by that? What does it mean, a culture of death? And it really caused, especially Americans, to sort of re-examine their values. And Pope Francis right now, he's such a rock star. People are really thinking about things and looking at the church in a new way because he has such a charismatic presence. So he lets the light of Christ and the light of the Spirit of Christ shine in the world and provides a vision so that our prayer can be fulfilled, that thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So to this end, we are going to make blogs. And originally, you don't have to do a blog if there's something else you like using more than, there's something else you like using more than Glogster, feel free as long as you can make a URL to it. So the assignment is in the Moodle book. Oh, by the way, if you wanted to use the scavenger hunt for your portfolio, if you click that link to Rosary's blog, there's pictures there you can use for your portfolio. You can also kind of show it to your parents if you told them about it and they didn't get to see. And actually, it's a lot of people from this class that are in the pictures. So, okay, so back down here. So the assignment itself is in the book under assignments. I'll show you in a second. And then you're going to put it here on the Pope Francis Glog. I think last year's might still be up there. You'll put your URL there so I can see them and we can all look at them. And it says due May 13th, so I guess that's when it's due. When's May 13th? What's today, the 9th? All right, so you'll put it there, and then I can look at them. But here's the assignment. There's Father Brendan. I miss Father Brendan. All right. All right, here's the assignment. So the idea is, oh, that was my article. Okay, so the idea is you're going to make something, some kind of presentation, whether it's a blog or you could do it on your phone, you can make like an iMovie, you can do whatever you want as long as you can put it somewhere where we can put a link on Moodle. So you're going to make a poster or whatever that shows the theme of the leadership role the Pope has. So it's not just to celebrate Pope Francis, it's also to show him as in a leadership role. So pick a theme, because there's going to be lots of stuff out there. When my students did this last year, it was harder because he had just been elected. But pick a theme for your poster, like shepherd, pastor, kingdom builder, humanitarian, peacemaker. I have the Rolling Stone cover in a frame next door. You could pick like rock star, because he gets the attention, interestingly, of the secular media in a way no pope really has before. I mean, you could say St. John Paul II, but he's even more popular than John Paul II. So you want to show him in a leadership role and try to pick a theme. And you're going to have 5 biographical facts. So you could start when he was born and then pick one of the most recent events as this happened as Pope. But pick events that would relate to your theme. So if you pick maybe champion of the poor, find events where he's working with the poor or talking about helping the poor. If you do peacemaker, find examples where he's talking about peace. If you do rock star, find examples where he's like doing like the selfies and kind of being a media leader in a way that's interesting and new. Then so your facts, your images, and the video should all relate to your theme. Then the fun facts, those could just be random. And then it should be aesthetically pleasing, meaning neat, well organized, basically look nice. You guys are pretty good at color coordination. Most of you are really good. The only thing is make sure your backgrounds aren't too busy. I've had a couple where I looked at it and I was like, whoa, okay, I get it. And make sure you can read your fonts. Use conservative fonts. But there's the rubric. The only thing that's different this time around is last time it was an individual assignment, and when I introduced this to period 1, they wanted the assignment to be a family assignment, so I said okay. So while you're working on this, have each person do something different. Like one person do your photos, well, I guess if you really wanted to. And then one person do the video. I guess, I don't really care, but in any case, make sure if you're in your family, you label what each person did so I know everybody contributed. And once you're done, so if you're the person who looked up the photos, pick your theme first, then find your photos for your theme, and you're like done and you've sent them to the girl who's putting it all together, you need to work on something for religion. So no Espanol, no biology, no, none of that. So do either your Chapter 8 flip lesson, you could do your Chapter 9 quiz that closes Monday, you could read Nostra Aetate if you haven't, you could work on your portfolio, but make sure you're working on religion, okay? Sound good? All right, go, like the wind.